That as we go through um, tonight's lesson on the War of 1812, that we can see again your glorious hand working on behalf of creating this nation, a nation that would establish itself as one nation under God, a nation that would establish itself on a 1607 covenant made not only for that generation, but as they confessed it and covenanted with you to all future generations of those that would inhabit this land. We give you the praise and thanksgiving in your name, Jesus. Amen. It has been said that the War of 1812 is the least remembered of all the wars that the U.S. has ever participated in. It went from 1812 to 1815, and some interesting things that happened that have become commonplace in terms of sayings or people came out of the war. It started in 1812, and you may have heard of the name Old Ironsides. How many have heard of that before? That is referring to the USS Constitution, and the way it got its name was that when it got into a battle on the sea with a frigate from Great Britain, the cannonballs from the frigate just bounced off the sides of the boat, and so they thought it was made out of metal, but it wasn't. It was actually just made out of very hard oak and put together in such a way that the cannonballs were just bouncing off of it. And so it got the name the Old Ironsides because of that. That was 1812. Then in 1813, you may have heard the story or the saying, "Don't give up the ship." That came out of a battle on the sea again. Actually, it started with a defeat. A fellow by the name of Captain Lawrence was on his boat and in battle, and it got basically destroyed, and he died. And in the battle, his last words were, "Don't give up the ship." If you go to the U.S. Naval Academy today, they have an actual monument. They're not a monument, excuse me, the banner that was flown, because the banner was not flown then. A friend of his by the name of Captain Perry, in fighting the battle at Lake Erie, in which we won. The Americans won this one. And General Perry, or Captain Perry, who was, I get mixed up because names of promotions that came later. Captain Perry, what he did was he was friends of Captain Lawrence, Lawrence having passed away, who said that saying. So Captain Perry had a flag made up to be able to be flown next to the other flags, the American flag, and his boat got blown up basically, and so he saved that and went to the next boat, the Niagara, and was victorious and had that banner flown, and that was specifically "Don't give up the ship." So you had 2012. Out of that comes Old Ironsides. 2013, "Don't give up the ship." As a matter of fact, Captain Perry is also known to have said, quote, "We have met the enemy and they are ours." Now, modern day, you hear, "We have met the enemy and it is ourselves," but that's not the original quote. It was what I just shared with you. Then in 2014, we have a very interesting thing happen, and that was on Lake Champlain in the battle that was there. The very smart, very well familiar with the area of Lake Champlain, the captain of the American boat knew of the winds in Lake Champlain. And because he knew how they operated, he decided, in defense of that area against the British ships that were coming, he decided simply to anchor his boat in a way so that his guns, the cannons on one side of the boat, were facing the British. The British came in, they became engaged in the war, firing the cannons, and once his side of the ship had been brutalized by the cannons from the British, what he did is there was a way that it was actually called kedging. And what they would do is they'd wrap a rope around a turning circular object and be able to pull on the rope and maneuver to turn around the boat to the other side. And the boats that came in representing Britain, they could not do that. The winds were such on Lake Champlain, neither it was the American boats or the British boats, they couldn't maneuver them the opposite way. So when the captain of the American ship used this device to actually manually turn around a ship, he was able to fire the other side cannons on the other side of the boat and win the victory. So you have some just interesting things, whether it's in names or sayings or battles, that came out of the War of 1812. The war itself began in 1812, but we go to 1815. The majority of what we'll talk about tonight is 14 and 15. The war, believe it or not, was called on by the Americans. The Americans declared war against Great Britain in 1812. Now think about it. We won our independence in 1783, right? And so 83, so 93, 03. Now we're 30 years later. And we'll see why they well, let me go into it now. We declared war against Great Britain because of the fact of what had been happening in those decades after we got our American independence. Remember, Great Britain is still the primary force or war machine in the world. They will have at this time approximately 400 plus warships. We had 16 at this point. And so in terms of dominance, Great Britain had the complete dominance in the situation. So that they used that dominance to come against America at every turn they could. They did it on the seas in terms of import-export. We would try to export goods from America to Europe. And remember, at this point in time, the Napoleonic Wars are going on, so Britain's over there firing on France a lot. And so what Britain would do is they wouldn't allow our ships to take the exports over to Europe. Sometimes when they would, they make us pay a fine to do it. But the reason why is they didn't want any goods to be getting into France, whether it was directly to France or through another country and then down to France. And so they were controlling imports and exports to our disadvantage. Secondly, they were involved in a occupation called impressment, not imprisonment, impressment. And what impressment was is they were stopping American ships, going on board and calling all the sailors out and then asking them questions. And in that, they could tell if someone had a British accent. If they had a British accent, they basically kidnapped that sailor off the American ship and then employed them in the British Navy. They were forced to do that. So what impressment was versus imprisonment, impressment was you'd call forced conscription. They were forced to do that. Well, there was over 6,000 sailors that were taken off of American ships because they had a British accent during this time. This was one of the things that caused ire on the Americans' behalf. One was the import-export, another was the impressment, and then a third one was that on the northwest end of what was happening. When I say northwest, I'm not talking about California. I'm talking about what would later become Michigan, Wisconsin, in that area, the Great Lakes area. That was considered the Northwest at that point. There was no further out there. And so what was happening at the Northwest is the British from Canada, the British Canadians, they were actually giving monies to the Indian tribes that were on their side to harass the American settlers. And when I say harass, that included murder, okay, of them. And so what it did is it kept Western expansion from happening. And so, and as a matter of fact, you probably have heard of the most famous Indian warrior, and this is where he was in that area, by the name of Tecumseh, okay? Very famous Indian warrior. Today, if you go to, I believe it's the Naval Academy, it's the Naval Academy, there is a monument there to Tecumseh because of his bravery, even though it was against us. Okay, it was against the Americans, but he was able to bring the tribes together. As a matter of fact, when he died, he was trying to bring a configuration of like 40 different tribes together in support of what the British was funding, because they were conscripted too. They were paid to fight the Americans in the expansion. Again, this is going on 30 years, 20 to 30 years after we got our independence. So it wasn't easy sailing, as I can use that term, from the gaining our independence and then in the years that followed. Another interesting phenomenon, and when we declared our independence, we had a false sense of security or over-optimism. And the reason was that during this time, the smaller part of the British war machine was here. By far, their largest part of their war machine was in Europe fighting against France. The Napoleonic Wars would go on for 20 plus years. And when finally Britain would defeat France and Napoleon would be exiled to an island called Elba. And when that happened in 1814, that would, for the first time in decades, allowed the British to come over in force. Well, the Americans were not expecting that. One of the things that the Americans were trying to do at this point in time, the soldiers and the commanders and all, was to go up into Canada. Again, there was a lot of activity happening up in the northwestern part of what is the United States at that time. Although, let's say, Michigan will not become a state until like 1839, I think it was, either 1837, 39. Wisconsin would be even later than that. So the war that would go on was really trying to take advantage of boundaries, okay? So we would make an incursion into Canada. The reason being is to get some bargaining chips against the impressment that the British were doing, okay? And so they would try to get in, but they would never be successful. The main point to understand here is in 1812, when we started this thing, we were not the same people we'll be in 1814. In 1812, we were run basically by local militias. A militia is not a standing army. A militia is a local area, and they have people that have volunteered, and they'll get together and defend their little locale, whatever it is, a town, a village, a city, whatever. And so that would then make it very difficult in terms of coordination. You would have also area disputes and the feelings towards each other from different areas. And the reason we did not have a standing army, you remember back under what we saw 30 years prior in the American Revolution, it would be von Steuben who would organize the Americans into a formidable unit. But with our independence, one of the great fears was to have a standing army. And the reason the Americans did not feel, or the colonists did not feel happy towards a standing army is because they knew what the standing army could do, and that is be used against the citizenry. And so then you get into the history of America and the whole Federalist versus non-Federalist, arguments that go on. But this was very strong. But what would happen in the course of the War of 1812, which will go to 1815, is progressively during that time, we will start to move to seeing the need for a standing army and take the chances with that. One of the things that happened during this period, which really led to early losses, is that when we declared war against Great Britain in 1812, the people that were chosen to lead the attempts to bring these groups together and form an army, they leaned heavily upon those that had been in the American Revolution. The problem? They were older now. And because they were older, they did not have the, if I can put it this way, the bravery of the young officers. And so what would transpire is they would run up the white flag and surrender a lot quicker. And they would take into consideration, especially, I was reading a story about one of them, one of our commanders or generals who was so concerned because his family was in the fort area, and he was so concerned about Indian warfare against them that immediately sent up the white flag because he was fearful of the scalping. And you've got to understand something about this revolution. There was actually a gentleman's code that was going on. I'll give you for instance, we're going to see in a minute the story of when Washington was burned, the city of Washington, D.C. was burned. And In that process, a young 10-year-old boy got in the line of fire and was shot and killed by a British soldier. As a result of that, the general in charge of the British Army there sent word out to all of the army that the mother's house of the little boy that was inadvertently killed, that they were to burn everything except that one house. And that was in remorse to the fact that this poor little 10-year-old got in the line of fire and was killed. So there was this concept of gentleman's respect and so forth. We've seen that sometimes when someone earlier in the revolution was in defeat, and we would be very generous towards the general that had to offer surrender and show them great respect. Well, put that over against Indian warfare, because there's where the scalping, there's where it was just an entirely different warfare. And so where there was gentleman type of warfare, even though it was bloody, when in this case, the general, this one fort, was really concerned about the fact that the Indians were coming. They were conscripted by the British up from Canada, and he was scared him to death. So he wasn't willing to fight, is what I'm simply trying to say. This will change, okay? By 1814, all those generals are out. They're gone. Now you have a young breed in there. And the young breed are going to be entirely different in terms of their looking towards their own futures, the future of the country, in terms of not being fearful. I read the story of one, and this is in the Canadian Army, but this one who was very famous, even to this day, for the Canadian people. And he was just very brave. And so there was a fellow in his area, meaning what I mean by that, that would be competitive towards him for his position. And so this guy, they were in conflict. And so this very famous one, the other guy says something bad to him, so he says something in return. So the guy that is going to now challenge this Canadian soldier, he's going to challenge him in a duel. And this guy's, meaning the guy that's doing the challenging, is an expert in dueling. And so the guy that becomes famous in Canada and helps greatly in their war he says, I will duel with you, but it'll be under my regulation of it. And he says, what is that? Because they're used to standing at 10, 15, 20 paces and firing in a duel. And he said, we'll each have our gun, and we'll stand the distance of this handkerchief away from each other. In other words, he put the handkerchief over the two guns and said, this is where we'll do the duel. Well, the other guy said, forget it, I'm out of here. In other words, he wasn't willing to go to that extent in the duel, whereas this fellow was willing to go that extent. If he had to die for what he believed in, he was going to do it. And so when these younger captains, majors, eventually generals came in on our side, then things started to pick up. And we'll see that in just a minute. Okay. Okay, I mentioned the Great Lakes. A lot of this was happening at the Battle of Detroit was a big one in terms of up in Great Britain against the in the Northwest. Okay, 1812, June of 1812, we declared war against Britain, Great Britain. And I've covered a lot of this, so I'm just going. Okay. In a letter to William Dunn on August 4th, 1812. I want to read this letter because I mentioned earlier that we entered into this over-optimistically, okay? One of those is because the main force was not involved yet. But number two, we felt that our size of our country, meaning the population number, was so much higher than that in Canada that if we went up there to take part of it, there wouldn't be a problem. Why do I say that? Because in this letter, to William Dunn from Thomas Jefferson stated, quote, the acquisition of Canada this year, as far as the neighborhood of Quebec, will be a mere matter of marching. What's he saying there? This is going to be so easy, it's like you're out on a march. And they felt that because they really felt that the Canadians didn't want to be under the rule of Britain any more than we did. And they felt that when our soldiers came into Canada, that they would be cheering for us. They would join up with us. And guess what? That was as far from the truth as you can imagine. And so we have really a similar, I mentioned this in the first service, we have a similar situation right now with our war that's going on with Iran. Because if you've noticed that both President Trump and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, they have called for the people of Iran to rise up and take back their country to the position it was in 1979 when the Shah was there. So far, nothing's happened. And you've got to understand the difference right now. Right now in Iran, you are basically, the people have grown up under the subjection of the Muslim faith and the imams who are still operating there in their churches. So when they go to their churches, what the imam is telling them, in other words, you've got to understand that there probably aren't as many people as you would think that are willing to rise up, because they may consider what their imams are telling them, and it's not going to be to go out and overturn our system, meaning Sharia law. Does anybody understand what I'm saying? And so the reason even though we're saying we're destroying everything, but there's not been that reaction that they're looking for. I'm simply making that to a comparison with the Canadians. You really don't know how a group of people are going to respond until something happens. And so far, you're not seeing it happen in Iran. I hope I'm making sense of this thing. You just got to look a little bit deeper on these things. And so when Thomas Jefferson made his suggestion that it was going to be a walk in the park, it wasn't a walk in the park at all. We never had any success in the 3, 4, 5, 6 times we sent standing groups up there of soldiers trying to take over. Okay. Okay. With the aid of the great Indian warrior and chiefs, Tecumseh, and escaped slaves, that's another thing you got to throw in here. We had escaped slaves from U.S. going up, trying to get free, and they did, and they go up to Canada, join the army to come against the Americans. So you have a group, a mixture here. With the great Indian warrior and chief Tecumseh, who was bringing groups of tribes together and escaped slaves along with Canadian townspeople and British regulars, that's the British standing army, the Americans never were successful in penetrating Canadian soil. They did hold, meaning the Americans did hold their own on American soil over the years 1812 to 1814. Then, as I mentioned earlier, in 1814, Napoleon is defeated. He is captured, exiled to the island of Elba, which now frees up for the first time in 20 years the British to come back in full, which leads us to the first miracle. We'll see 3 of them tonight. And the first one is of the War of 1812 in the year 1814. At the end of the Napoleonic Wars, or the end of the Napoleonic Wars, served as a catalyst for Great Britain's attack on our nation. At the onset of the war, July 9th, 1812, President James Madison called for a day of prayer, stating, quote, "I do therefore recommend rendering the sovereign of the universe public homage, acknowledging the transgressions which might justly provoke his divine displeasure, seeking his merciful forgiveness, and with a reverence for the unerring precept of our holy religion," obviously referring to Christianity, "to do to others as they would require that others should do to them." So what, again, we're seeing over and over again, there's no doubt that the founders, now we're 30 years removed from the American Revolution, and they're still seeing our nation as a Christian nation with a holy religion, meaning Christianity. It didn't mean other religions were not allowed, but the mainstay of our people was Christianity. The first miracle took place August 24th, 1814, when the British attacked Washington, D.C. Under the command of Admiral George Cockburn, 4,500 British troops marched into Washington, D.C. and entered the Capitol building. Now let's take a look at if we could, at the first of the maps. Okay, and if you go ahead into the closer one. Well, before you do that, oh, that's fine there. Okay, there we go. So Washington, D.C., if you can see it there, is right here. And the British troops, the 4,500 men, were going to come in here by the Chesapeake Bay, and then a mistake is going to be made. They are going to head up to Bladensburg, where they're going to take that instantly. They're going to overtake that. Very good. Thank you, David. And it was predicted and scoffed at that they would then come into Washington, because Washington, D.C. wasn't a water port. There weren't ships coming in and out to resupply. It was Baltimore. So it was predicted and followed that the belief was that the British were going to, after taking Bladensburg, they were going to head to Baltimore. Well, guess what? They did not head to Baltimore. They came right back to Washington, D.C. And so as they headed towards Washington, D.C., the word got out. You've probably seen pictures of this or seen it in a movie or whatever. As soon as the people of Washington, D.C., there was no standing army there. There was no militia there. They were all fighting either up in the Northwest or in other places. And so immediately there's going to be a total evacuation from Washington, D.C. It'll be here where you'll hear the story of Dolly Madison. And just for information, her name is spelled Dolley, Dolly Madison, not like the cupcakes or whatever she's selling now. Different Dolly Madison. Okay, so that will be where Dolly Madison will save a copy of the Declaration of Independence. I think everybody knows that the Declaration of Independence, you had multiple copies of it. At least I think it was like 11 that were in the D.C. area eventually, because the states were getting them, or the colonies were getting them to the declarations. And so she will save one of those, and she'll also save a very important painting. If you want to show the painting of George Washington. And her feeling was that if the British got a hold of this, it would have been their prized possession to taunt the American people that the conquering general who became president, that this beautiful painting by Gilbert Stuart was taken. And so what she did was it was bolted to the wall, so she couldn't take the whole frame. She had to have them take the frame off it quickly. This is happening real quickly. And so they took off the frame and they rolled it up. She gave it to two trusted men to take from there to basically hide it, to protect it, so it wouldn't fall into the hands of the British. And it's at this point that Admiral Cockburn comes into town, meaning Washington, D.C. He's going to go to the house, or the White House, and there Dolly Madison had prepared a large meal for 20 or so people and left in a hurry and left it there. So he had all of his generals and all of his lead soldiers sit down at the table, and they enjoyed the food that was prepared for George Washington's War Department. But they ate there first. Then they got up from there and they went over to the Capitol. And at the Capitol building, the Admiral Cockburn, had members of his troops sit in the chairs of the congressmen, while he proceeded to the Speaker's chair and asked for a vote if they should burn down the Capitol. The Capitol, including both houses of Congress, the Supreme Court, the Library of Congress, and the White House, were all set ablaze. But before everything was completed in terms of the burning, all of a sudden, something happened that they weren't expecting. And that is, before they had completed destroying the city, the sky turned black as a freak storm engulfed the city. Rain, wind, thunder, and lightning ripped buildings from their foundations and trees up by the roots, knocked riders off their horses, and crashed walls down on the British troops. Cannons were tossed around by the winds, and several British troops were killed by the falling structures and flying debris. British Admiral Cockburn was heard asking a woman, "Great God, madam, is this the kind of storm to which you are accustomed in this infernal country?" And then the woman replied, "No, sir, this is a special interposition of Providence to drive our enemies from our city." A British historian wrote, quote, "More British soldiers were killed by the stroke of nature than from all the firearms the American troops had mustered in the feeble defense of their city." The British troops were finishing up their operation when the violent storm arrived. George Robert Klieg, a British soldier on the scene, detailed what happened next in his memoirs as the severe weather rolled into the city in the afternoon. This is quoting from his memoirs. "Of the prodigious force of the wind, it is impossible for you to form any conception. Roofs of houses were torn off by it and whisked into the air like sheets of paper, while the rain which accompanied it resembled the rushing of a mighty cataract rather than the dropping of a shower, Klieg wrote. Klieg said the incident produced, quote, the most appalling effect I had ever or ever probably shall ever witness. Klieg went on to say that the severe weather lasted for 2 hours, dumping torrential rain on the city, and he personally was knocked off his horse. He also said he saw 2 cannons picked up in the air and tossed around during the most violent part of the storm. According to other accounts, part of the storm seemed tornado-like. The winds tore the roofs off the General Post Office and patent office buildings, and trees were uprooted. Michael Shiner, who was then a young slave in Washington, accounted the storm in memoirs published after he had gained his freedom. Shiner said that during the event, houses were picked up by the winds and landed back on their foundations. In the storm's aftermath and subsequent British departure, President Madison and the American forces returned to Washington to see the destruction. The White House and Capitol were rebuilt, and Thomas Jefferson donated his book collection to restock the Library of Congress. During this British siege on Washington, Dolly Madison famously saved the Gilbert Stuart portrait of George Washington and a copy of the Declaration of Independence before she fled to nearby Georgetown. The providential storm also put out all the remaining fires, and the British soldiers marched back to their ships, only to find 2 of their ships washed ashore and several others with severe damage. The second miracle took place to the north in Baltimore, September 13th and 14th, 1814. So we're going to go, yep, there's the burning of the White House. All right, let's go to the next picture, back to that map. And you can see just north of Washington is Baltimore. And this is where, right over here at Fort McHenry, the second miracle is going to transpire. Now, the reason I handed out the stamps early is I wanted you to look specifically at the one that has 2 stamps in it. And one of them is a picture or a portrait of Francis Scott Key. And then the other is the statement, "In God We Trust." Okay? Those stamps came out, like I said, we have a 3 cent, a 4 cent, and a 5 cent. And so they came out anyway from the 1940s through the 60s. Okay. Britain sent 19 of its most powerful warships to Baltimore. American general and commander of Fort McHenry, George Armistead, knew Fort McHenry would be the key to defending the city. If the fort fell, Baltimore would fall. And there was a good chance America would fall as well. One of the British ships included the HMS Volcano, a state-of-the-art ship which could shoot a 90-pound cast-iron bomb designed to travel 2 miles. The fort's cannons had less than half that range, so the fort would need to sit and accept its punishment, waiting for the British to run out of ammunition. Adding to the extreme danger was the fort's powder magazine, where they stored the gunpowder, which was extremely vulnerable to mortar fire. During one incredible moment, the American defenders could see an incoming shell heading straight toward the powder magazine. The shell made a direct hit, but nothing happened. The next morning, the British fleet ran out of ammunition. In all, Fort McHenry withstood a bombardment of 1,800 bombs, meaning cannonballs, in a 24-hour period. But only 4 Americans were killed, and the buildings were only slightly damaged. This was due to the providential storm that had saved Washington, D.C., which was now over Baltimore. Most of the cannonballs fired at the fort fell unexploded in the mud surrounding the fort. So they kept taking aim, but because of the winds, they couldn't get the directions correct. The directions were under providential control. Whether it was the one that hit the magazine and nothing happened, or the ones that were falling short. On the morning of September 14th, 1814, an amazed Francis Scott Key on the HMS either Surprise or Tonnant, because there's a difference of opinion which boat he was on, awoke in disbelief to see that Fort McHenry still was standing with the American flag still in place on top of the fort. There, the prisoner, let me give you some background here. Francis Scott Key didn't go into the boat as a prisoner. What he was on is he was charged with the rescuing of an individual, a doctor who had been picked up, impressment, and they went to secure his release. In the process of getting his release, which they secured, meaning that he was going to take him out of the English or British hands, Key overheard the upcoming battle that was happening later that night, the attack on Fort McHenry. Because of that, he and another individual with him that was part of that party to rescue this doctor were put in the prison there until they didn't want them to go off and tell anybody of what was about to happen. Okay? So, Francis Scott Key, Francis Scott Key penned the Star-Spangled Banner on the back of a napkin. Okay? He woke up, he saw that. He said that he was so fearful he could hardly sleep because he was anticipating the stopping of the bombing. And he knew if that happened, if the bombing stopped, he knew that the fort had fallen. And so the fact that when he went to sleep, when he woke up, there was, until the sun rose, it had not stopped, gave him the assurance that everything was going to be okay, so that when he saw the fort and the flag still up there, he penned this. And the fourth stanza states, quote, "Oh, thus be it ever, when free men shall stand between their loved home and war's desolation, blessed with victory and peace, may the heaven-rescued land praise the power that has made and preserved us a nation. Then conquer we must, when our cause it is just, and this be our motto, in God is our trust. And the star-spangled banner in triumph shall wave over the land of the free and the home of the brave." Now, that was published, when that was written and then handed out when he got out the next day, that was published in major papers all over the states within a week. It was running rampant, through it, let me give you the history behind it. Within a week, the song was published in every major newspaper in America. The motto, "In God We Trust," from the final stanza, grew in popularity, as did the song itself. The first time the phrase appeared on American coinage was during the Civil War, 1864. And here's the coin right here. This is the real deal. This is a 2-cent piece. And I'm going to ask you if you would, one of the two of you here. Joyce, why don't you do this one? If you look at it on the one side, it says 2-cent piece, and it has around the outside of it the United States of America. And then on the other side, there is a little banner at the top. You can see it very easily, unless you want to make it easier, just shine your flashlight on it. And then underneath it, it lists the date of 1864. So if you'll let it, see, when you hold this could have been held by Abraham Lincoln. This could have been, it was produced for the North. So it could have ended up on the battlefield. It could have been held by, who knows, but from 1864. And again, it was produced to give encouragement that to the North that they were on God's side, that God was working on their behalf because they were doing righteously what God wanted. So if you'll pass that around. And if anybody tries to take it and run out of here, the first service created stocks and what do you call it? Yeah. All right, so pass that around while we're doing this. Yeah, gallows are out there too. Okay, do we hand that to somebody else so they can? Okay, yeah, okay. So someone's going to have to kind of, George, why don't you be in custody of it? Meaning you walk around so everybody gets a chance to see it. Take your time with it. The motto, "In God We Trust," from the final stanza grew in popularity, as did the song itself. The first time the phrase appeared on American coinage was during the Civil War, 1864, that 2-cent piece, to encourage and inspire Union troops. The song itself became the de facto national anthem by Woodrow Wilson in 1916 and was later formally adopted as our national anthem under Herbert Hoover in 1931. The first time "In God We Trust" appeared on our paper currency was 1955 to distinguish us from communism during the Cold War under President Dwight Eisenhower. In 2018, the phrase "In God We Trust" on American currency withstood a lawsuit. 2018, we're all here, okay? In 2018, the phrase "In God We Trust" on American currency withstood a lawsuit brought by a contingent of 27 atheists. The lawsuit argued that the placement of the motto violated the Establishment Clause of our Constitution. You got to understand what was going on here. 2018, we are now suffering. I mean, you think about wokeism, which really came into vogue right following COVID, right in that area of COVID. But up to that point, we're becoming more and more liberal, more and more liberal. So this was an attempt by the atheists to take another thing out of our culture. Remember, in 1963, they've already taken God out of the schools. They've taken the Bible out of schools. They've taken prayer out of schools. 1980, they'll take, or 85, they'll take away the 10 Commandments. So here we are in 2018, and they felt the time was ripe. Let's get God out of the culture in another way, okay? And so they presented this lawsuit. In the 2018 Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled, however, that the inscription of the national motto, "In God We Trust," on currency does not violate the Establishment Clause, nor amount to compelled speech, nor violate the Free Exercise Clause, nor infringe on a person's right under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which is a 1993 United States federal law that, quote, ensures that interests in religious freedom are protected. And you'll never guess who was the senator that brought that to the floor and got it passed. This bill, oh, not senator, House of Representatives, so it's congressman. This bill was introduced on March 11th, 1993 by Congressman Chuck Schumer. Now, think about that for a second. Here we are in 2026, and I got a feeling that he wouldn't have suggested that now. As a matter of fact, I think it's so interesting watching how people change. We saw over the last 2 weeks, we saw how Benedict Arnold was the hero of the War of Saratoga and then ended up wanting to turn President Washington and West Point over to the British for 20,000 pounds. Last week, we saw Thomas Paine, who was admired by all the key people that would end up being signers of the Constitution, signers of the Declaration of Independence. Washington spoke and thought highly of him. John Adams, all these people, they thought highly of them. And then all of a sudden he produces something which basically is an attack on the Bible and an attack on Christianity. That's what we saw last week. And so instead of, he went from being a hero, not in a military sense, even though he served, he was a hero in what he produced, which increased the morale of the American soldiers. When he wrote Common Sense, and then when he wrote his 16 pamphlets that throughout the war encouraged. But then here he is at the end, actually destroying his own self to the place where he couldn't find a graveyard that would take his bones. And so he had to have himself buried on his own property, and then later his bones were totally lost. So when you see people today and you see what they said, and they're doing that a lot too. They're showing people what they said 5 years ago and how then they come back hypocritically and come against what they said 5 years prior because it's for political advantage. That's a lack of character. And I think it's really important to say at this point that the scripture's really clear. Those who endure to the end shall be saved. Now, I'm saying that in a religious sense. Moving over to the political realm, the way politics is supposed to be run too is you're supposed to be a person of conscience, and what your true belief is what you should expose and expound on. and it shouldn't be something just for political advantage. Y'all vote as a block, and then you try to say, well, I didn't really mean that. Okay? All right. Now back to 1814. So frequent were divine interpositions throughout the founding and preserving of America. On March 22nd, 1814, Francis Scott Key, who just had written the Star-Spangled Banner a month before, told the Washington Society in Alexandria, Virginia, quote, "The patriot who feels himself in the service of God, who acknowledges him in all his ways, has the promise of almighty direction and will find his word," meaning God's word, "in his greatest darkness, a lantern to his feet and a lamp unto his paths. He will therefore seek to establish for his country in the eyes of the world such a character as shall make her not unworthy of the name of a Christian nation." So here we are in 1814. We've already established over and over again through key persons like George Washington, governors, the Continental Congress, the undeniable truth that they all saw us as a Christian nation. And so now we move 30 years further to 1814, and we find Francis Scott Key, who writes the Star-Spangled Banner, our national anthem, and he's saying that the character that we want to have in our nation is that which would support us as a Christian nation. On November 16th, 1814, President James Madison proclaimed a national day of public humiliation, fasting, and prayer. And that's why I'm going back, or our family, me and Janet and Grace are going back to May 17th to Washington, D.C., because the president in our time has called for a day of fasting, prayer, humiliation, to pray that God would forgive us our sins and that we could truly be a one nation under God. And so that's my motivation, okay? And here, and as we've seen, these days have been called over and over again where it's perceived that we're in a crisis, whether it's a crisis of morals, a crisis of turning away from God, a crisis of war, whatever it is. And this is what happened then. On November 16th, 1814, President James Madison proclaimed a national day of public humiliation, fasting, and prayer, stating, quote, "The two houses of the national legislature, having by a joint resolution expressed their desire that in the present time of public calamity and war, a day may be recommended to be observed by the people of the United States as a day of public humiliation, fasting, and of prayer to Almighty God for the safety and welfare of these states, his blessing on their arms," because we're involved in a war, "and a speedy restoration of peace, of confessing their sins and transgressions, of strengthening their vows of repentance, that he would be graciously pleased to pardon all their offenses. I have deemed it proper to recommend a day of humble adoration to the great sovereign of the universe." The third miracle took place on January 8th, 1815. Let's go to the next picture. Oh, you got it right there. Very good. The next picture. Now, in a minute, I'm going to ask you to turn this on. It's a little video, but I want to set it up here. So this is the Battle of New Orleans, or Nolens, depending where you're coming from. And the British, with their 10,000 troops, are going to enter here, this bay, and they're going to come up and make landing, and the battle's going to happen right here, where God's going to intervene. 10,000 troops against 1,000 troops. And they're going to come right up here. Now, they've, as a matter of fact, go ahead and hit the button if you would. And you have to watch this. It goes rather quickly, and I'll show you what's going to happen here. There are troops. They're going to get either blown up or captured, the people off of it. And here come the British. And now they're going to send over here. All right, they're going to go up here to the canal. But in the meantime, they're going to be fought off. But here come the rest of them. Here comes the British Army. And they are going to head up here to this canal. They're going to shoot, and now they're going to come up here. Come on, guys. There we go. But something's going to happen, and all of a sudden they're going to retreat, but minus a whole lot of their soldiers. So let's get into that story. The third miracle took place on January 8th, 1815. 10,000 British troops landed at New Orleans. This landing followed the capturing of 5 American warboats, that's what you saw, by the British fleet. The Americans, under the leadership of General Andrew Jackson, who has already made a name for himself as a warrior, as a general. He has got a name for himself already down in that area fighting. Under the leadership of General Andrew Jackson, consisted of only 1,000 trained militia. Again, militia is not like a standing army. 1,000 trained militia and a combination of Indians, free American men of color, merchants, pirates, and farmers. In preparation for the inevitable British attack, General Jackson fortified an area located on a canal which joined the Mississippi River. The Mississippi is on one side. There's going to be swampland on the other. The canal was fortified and served as a moat and was about 1,000 yards long, bordered by the Mississippi River on one side and a swamp on the other side. The British came ashore in secret, being protected by darkness and a heavy fog. Now, remember what we said last week, that at the Battle of Yorktown, which also included the Battle of the Capes, you had what's his name? The British general, Cornwallis. You had Cornwallis and his 9,000 troops, and to get safely across the York River so that he could get up to safety in New York, he has to ferry them across. Now, that should sound vaguely familiar, because in the first battle of the American Revolution, George Washington had 9,000 troops. He had to ferry across the East River into New York to save our army. God sent a fog, and that fog stayed on the water and on the land there until the last of the soldiers were across. Last week, in the last battle of the American Revolution, okay, Yorktown, you had the British under Cornwallis, 9,000 troops having to ferry across, but God did the opposite. Instead of helping them, he sent a squall, which totally dissembled their ability to get across and led to Cornwallis having to surrender. Okay, and as we recalled last week, it happened right in the area of the Battle of the Capes, which is part of that, which was Cape Henry, where in 1607 the covenant was made with God for the future generations of our nation. So the last battle of the American Revolution ended at the very place where the covenant was made with the Lord. So you can see those parallels. So here we have a fog that's covering the British at the Battle of New Orleans to give them safety. They've just won or destroyed one settlement, and now they're heading up to New Orleans proper. Having taken one settlement, as they proceeded to the next settlement, they reached a clearing in front of the canal where suddenly and providentially the fog lifted, leaving the mighty British army totally exposed. As the fog lifted, Tennessee and Kentucky sharpshooters pinpointed their aim at the British officers with deadly success. Now, what's going to happen is, as the officers go down, the soldiers are not going to have any leadership anymore. With little or no leadership, the British army became confused and simply hunkered down in the field. In the end of less than 20 minutes, 2,042 British soldiers had been killed, while only 71 Americans died. On the next day, January 9th, French consul Louis de Touzard wrote, quote, "Yesterday, the British experienced the most bloody butchery ever recorded in American history. They were entirely slaughtered from the heavy fire of 18 or 20 pieces of artillery." On January 26, 1815, General Jackson wrote to Robert Hayes concerning the victory in New Orleans and stated, quote, "It appears that the unerring hand of Providence shielded my men from the balls, bombs, and rockets when every ball and bomb from our guns carried with them a mission of death, end of quote. General Jackson told his aide-de-camp after the battle, quote, I was sure of success, for I knew that God would not give me previsions of disaster, but signs of victory. This ditch can never be passed, meaning the canal. It cannot be done. A military surgeon, Joseph O. Conway, who was present at the Battle of New Orleans, wrote his father stating, quote, let all Europe hear that the elite of those troops who boasted having carried the most redoubtable fortresses in Spain, achieved the dethronement of the Emperor Napoleon, have been defeated in the sight of the city of New Orleans by a heterogeneous description of farmers, merchants, lawyers, boatmen, tailors, doctors, clerks. In fact, every kind of professional and tradesman forming the population of a country. Tell it at Washington City that the state of Louisiana, where the government expected the least patriotism, has fairly driven away and compelled those troops to re-embark with a loss of 2/3 of their army, most of their generals and other officers. Let the bright example of Louisiana glory be caught throughout the eastern rebellious states. Let them learn what immortal honors have been gained by the heroes of New Orleans. End of quote. But this is not the end of the story. Anticipating the British attack on New Orleans, people of faith began prayer vigils. One of those people groups was the Ursuline nuns in a local convent. They, along with townspeople, prayed for the protection of God and the defeat of the enemy. As they prayed, a townsperson bolted in declaring the British had fallen. Following the American victory, General Andrew Jackson personally visited the convent to thank the nuns for their prayers. For the past 220 years, every January 8th, over the past 220 years, the Ursuline nuns sing a special song of adoration to God called the Te Deum, which was sung January 8th, 1815, when the news of the American victory reached the convent. On February 17th, 1815, General Jackson wrote to Secretary of War James Monroe, quote, heaven, to be sure, has interposed most wonderfully in our behalf, and I am filled with gratitude when I look back to what we have escaped. 9 days later, Napoleon escaped from the island of Elba. As a result, all British troops were ordered to leave America to again fight the French. Had Napoleon not been such a threat to the British, Great Britain would have continued to focus all of their strength against the United States. On March 4th, 1815, President James Madison proclaimed a national day of thanksgiving to Almighty God, stating, quote, no people ought to feel greater obligations to celebrate the goodness of the great disposer of events distinguished by the multiplied tokens of his benign interposition. Great Britain would never again cross the great ocean to levy war against her now free daughter nation. However, there remained a people on the shores of America who remained shackled. Their story and eventual emancipation will be examined next week. Questions? Questions or thoughts? It's what? Oh, thank you. To those of you watching at home, either by YouTube or Facebook, thank you for being with us tonight. We'll be back next Wednesday, same time, same channel. Hope you'll be with us. God bless you.